background, I was born in Ukraine. I was born in Kiev. So I grew up in Ukraine, Germany, Japan, and the United States. My career was as a professional race car driver. Initially, I started that right out of high school in the United States to learn how to become a driver on a racetrack. Competed in some amateur events. Had very good success early on, and that just led to an invitation from Nissan and Nissan Motorsports to come to Japan and race. And I spent many years in my 20s in that career path in Japan. So when the invasion began on the 24th of February, of course, I myself also I'm an American citizen, but I have family in Ukraine, and it's my birthplace. So this is something that was very shocking initially, very difficult to believe it's happening, but such is life sometimes. And given that there's just no possibility for me to be able to actually go to Ukraine and help on the ground, I was just really working really hard and thinking how I can help. So how I can help personally, what I can contribute to try to bring an end to this nightmare. And I never really used Twitter in the past. My account was basically dormant. I had like 200 followers, and I began to actually start writing about my thoughts on this terrible situation on March 1st. Initially, I shared my thread as a reply to one of Garry Kasparov's tweets, and a lot of his readers picked up on that and shared it. And so at that point, I actually ended up with a little bit of an audience. I think it went from like 200 followers to 800 followers. And on March 5th, I stumbled upon a public post by Vladimir Osechkin that he made on Facebook, which was the Russian text of that very first letter that I translated. And as I read it in Russian, I thought that this must get translated into English because it offered such huge insight into how Russia works and what Russia is as a country, as a system under Putin. Once I made that translation and posted on Twitter, of course, it picked up a lot of steam very quickly. It was seen by over 30 million people on Twitter alone. I think very largely thanks to Alexander Vindman retweeting it and urging his readers to check it out. But it was also retweeted by a pretty renowned Japanese politician, various ambassadors, former and current, from around the world, current parliamentarians in the European Union, and so on. And at that point, of course, it is very healthy to have doubts and questions about what this letter is. And I was in that camp myself. But on the face of it, the contents of the letter make total sense. It is written very eloquently in a way that a common layperson can understand. And I reached out to Vladimir Osechkin. I had no contact with him ever before. I knew very little about him. Right after that initial translation was making a huge impact in people's minds. And it was a very interesting conversation. He was very happy to see what had happened with that translation. And he was just astounded by the response and the exposure that these contents received in English. He posted this letter on Facebook more as a curiosity. The reason being, people that actually understand Russia, that understand how even just the Russian-speaking world works, there aren't huge revelations in that first letter. It's written very well, but most of these things are rather obvious to Russian speakers. And I want to take this chance now to get into Vladimir's background to explain why there is this communication that's back and forth between Vladimir and the Wind of Change. So Vladimir was, and currently still is, a human rights activist who is Russian, but he's in exile in France since 2015. For over 10 years now, his mission has been to expose and stop the systemic, horrible tortures that are occurring inside Russian prisons. This has been his personal fight for a very long time. These tortures are state sanctioned by the Russian government. And prior to 2015, he was active trying to provide exposure to this situation from inside Russia. But at a certain point, he ended up getting tipped off that it's best that he actually leave the country. So in terms of him getting information from inside the Russian intelligence community, that itself is nothing new. And the reason for that is because there are a lot of people that are in the Russian intelligence community, including the FSB, that completely agree that state-sanctioned systemic tortures that are ordered inside Russian prisons should not be happening and should be stopped. So he began to receive a lot of information from inside the apparatus, including evidence of surveillance videos, all kinds of specific information, videos, photos from inside the Russian intelligence community, because those people that were sending it to him wanted this to be exposed, and they saw him as a channel to expose it, and he was already working on that. So if we fast forward to the current day, he was in touch. He got contacted by the Wind of Change last year. So that first letter that I translated is not the first letter from the Wind of Change. It's the first letter from the Wind of Change since the Russian invasion. And that very first letter that he received from the Wind of Change, which I will translate eventually when I have time, and again, this is also public, is it goes into a lot of detail about a FSB operation that has been ordered to discredit Vladimir Osechkin himself, including trying to frame him for certain, I think it was financial crimes, things of that nature. So the first contact by the Wind of Change to Vladimir Osechkin was specifically giving Vladimir Osechkin a heads up that you got to watch out. The FSB's now onto you. You're an inconvenience, even though you're no longer in Russia. And that dynamic, again, is not something new for Vladimir. He experienced that back in 2015 as well. Naturally, what unifies or what helps explain this relationship between the Wind of Change and Vladimir Osechkin personally is their paramount belief that the prison tortures in Russia need to be stopped. That is where they have that common ground, and that is the reason that he is constantly encouraged by such people that are inside the Russian intelligence to keep going, and he receives a lot of inside information. So naturally, these emails took a turn once Putin decided to invade Ukraine on February 24th. And the contents of the best way to describe the relationship between the Wind of Change and Vladimir Osechkin, they're pen pals with a common cause. So it is communication back and forth. Vladimir is not publishing any communication that he's sending to Wind of Change, but you can even see within the context of some of these letters that Wind of Change is answering to Vladimir's questions. And so after the invasion, that first letter was sent as it's a personal letter in a way. And of course, Vladimir always published these letters publicly with express permission of the Wind of Change. So Wind of Change knew that these letters would be publicized. And of course, he's taken the necessary precautions to keep his cover. Once we got this enormous response to the translation in English that I posted, Wind of Change from inside the FSB began to accelerate leaking insider information to Vladimir Osechkin, expecting that it will be published. So, because there's this objective that you can clearly deduct from these letters, and that is to help the West understand this enigma that is Putin and the Kremlin and Russia. Because none of this stuff is that complicated at the end of the day. It's just that it is such a different world compared to the West and way of life that the West just doesn't have the comprehension. After I got in touch with Vladimir, after the first translation, we began to collaborate actively together. So we keep close contact with each other, and we are in coordination. So again, even this talk that I'm giving right now, it is a talk that I asked Vladimir about to ensure that we're on the same page with this, and that he's cool with me doing it. The impact on Vladimir's mission that, of course, started from these tortures that he wanted to expose inside the Russian prisons, and has, of course, evolved like any normal human being to try to put a stop and somehow end this war and the impending genocide of the Ukrainian people. He's trying to do everything he can to expose how Putin works so that the Western public understands, so that the Western politicians that have the power to stop it understand, right? The intelligence communities, they're not surprised by this stuff, by the contents of these letters, but they're not the decision makers either. And so it comes down to the civilian leadership around the Western world. With regards to the impact that it has had, it's been really amazing. So Vladimir has been absolutely exuberant. While he was posting these letters in Russian, there wasn't much attention on them from the West because it's in Russian. If you try to do machine translation on them, it is just total nonsense. It comes out as garbage. It's very difficult to understand. So nobody picked up on this stuff. And he's been doing interviews all over the world now, nonstop, about these letters, about the context of them, about the importance of them. And I feel like it is making a pretty significant impact. So, I mean, he did an interview with Taiwan. I was contacted by a Japanese journalist a few days back. Wonderful person. She already finished and published her story on Vladimir Osechkin the other day. There's going to be follow-ups on that. Interviews that, we are providing, whether it's like radio or in print. This is a sort of a team effort now. And the really important thing, I think, is to understand the context, right? As you read these letters, understand what the actual context is here, which is this is two pen pals writing about this insane stuff. And the recent developments, so this is pretty important. The FSB wasn't really interested in doing much of anything while these letters were only in Russian and weren't getting picked up by the Western public. But after that first translation, things really began to change. After or around the 11th letter, could have been right before, I'm not sure specifically on the timing, the FSB created a team to very methodically work to spread doubt and disinformation about these published letters from the Wind of Change. And that is something that should be another indication that they're worried about it. And it makes sense that they weren't too worried about it when it was just in Russian, because, again, Russian people understanding this stuff is not going to help overthrow the Putin regime. But the Western world understanding this stuff, it is a bit of a a roadmap on how to actually do it, right? One of the important things that are really the two constants that Wind of Change has been relaying in all these letters, if you take them as a whole, is that number one, and this is so vitally important, that Putin is convinced that the West will not respond militarily to whatever he does. It may be delusional. It may not be delusional, right? I mean, there's a lot of talk that the West will respond if, say, he starts shelling Poland. Who knows? It's never happened before, so we don't know. But regardless, it's important that these letters expose the mindset that is currently shared by the people at the very top in the Kremlin and Putin. They are doing everything from the standpoint and conviction that the West will not respond militarily. So when they started intentionally bombing and shelling Ukrainian cities after their failed blitzkrieg, they're committing these war crimes because they're convinced the West won't respond militarily. And so far, they've been right. The other key constant throughout all of these letters is the Wind of Change's understanding that nuclear saber rattling is just that. It's just bark from the position of the Kremlin. The Western media eats it up every time. They just always amplify any kind of official spokesperson's messages about how you do this or you do that, then we'll respond. We're reserving our right to respond with a nuclear attack if so and so, or whatever they're saying, it gets amplified. And it has been extremely effective because people in the West are very much afraid of that possibility. But what these letters do from that regard is this assertion by the Wind of Change that is the Kremlin tactic. Because so long as the West is scared of a nuclear attack, which would be just absolutely insane, like that would lead to the end of the world. There are so many people involved in actually launching nuclear weapons. It's not like Putin can press a button himself. There are things there are at the end of the day safeguards, and nobody wants the end of the civilization, including the very most evil, psychopathic people that occupy the top ranks within the Kremlin. Right? But it feeds back into number one, right? So number two is that the nuclear saber rattling is just an empty threat. But because that threat is working, that gives them more conviction that the West won't respond militarily. And so the dynamic in these letters has changed. If you go through them chronologically, the tone and the attitude was one of just depression, the disbelief that Putin was crazy enough to actually invade the entire Ukraine, because they thought it would maybe inside the FSB, maybe Putin might just officially recognize Donbass, march some troops around there, and call it a day and call it a victory. From context, it's clear that the FSB probably found out that it's not just saber rattling that he placed 200,000 troops surrounding Ukraine, that it was actually going to be an invasion. about a week prior to the invasion. That's when it appears the FSB found out. So in a week, they couldn't do anything to prepare. And so there came a breaking point just recently in that tone and the sense of urgency and other communications that have not been published. That sense of urgency from the wind of change is coming as a direct result of his realization based on what's the goings on inside the Kremlin, where he previously thought that there's no win for Russia in this situation, and there's not really an out, because this invasion has been a total failure militarily. That development that he describes in the 11th letter is what has began to cause a bit of panic inside the FSB with the wind of change and some of his people. So it is a movement, right? So I talked about the mutiny that's already started inside the FSB. Right now, it's a secret mutiny, but it's a urgent call for the West to stop Putin, because what he realized was that Putin does have a win and he does have an out as a result of this Russian invasion, as horrible as it has been going on from a military perspective. And that is the extermination of the Ukrainian people. So Putin started with the delusion pre-invasion that he will be welcomed as a liberator of the Ukrainian people. So, you know, it was a feedback loop of their own propaganda. It was just nonsensical. And their intelligence services were supporting that point of view, because it was just an empty theoretical exercise, because nobody thought that he would actually invade. But once Putin realized that militarily on the ground he's gonna fail, what he changed his plan to, as a result of realizing that the Ukrainian people will not submit to his reign and his rule in Ukraine, he has decided to change his plan, which is to simply eliminate all of the Ukrainian people that refuse to submit to him until the only people that are left do submit to him. And the big danger here is that he can accomplish that from afar. A lot of that, which is already started once the ground invasion sort of stagnated. He began to methodically destroy Ukrainian cities and civilians intentionally. He's going to continue doing that. There's nothing that will stop him from doing that. Ukraine cannot stop him from doing that, because Ukraine doesn't have good anti-air capabilities. Very few planes in the Ukrainian Air Force. And so Ukraine has been left completely exposed from sort of weapons of mass destruction that Putin can launch from afar, even from inside Russia. So he's going to continue to level city after city after city, even if he's failing on the ground. And he's going to do everything to bring the Ukrainian people into submission, and he's doesn't care how many Ukrainians will be left at that point. If there is nobody left, to him, it doesn't appear to matter. He doesn't value human life. I'm sure everybody understands that. So, this is what the recent big development inside the FSB involving the wind of change has been. He has, and he's written about this in these last letters, he completely now understands without any doubt that Putin is following Hitler's and Stalin's playbook, right? Hitler and Stalin were actually acting very similarly. And the information that keeps coming out from different sources continues to support that position. From the stuff that's happening inside Russia, in terms of just society, from what he's doing, right? The big news that I posted about yesterday from a source is that he's going to be establishing an alternative international tribunal. My understanding is it's a military tribunal, so that he can lay that groundwork to prepare his own domestic propaganda, to tighten the screws on the Russian civilian population, and to ensure that he keeps his power consolidated within the ranks of the top people at the Kremlin. That they're going to systemically start blaming the Ukrainian prisoners of war that they have captured for this impending extermination of the Ukrainian civilians. I mean, all these pieces just fit. It's very simple. It's not a shock to, as far as what he's been doing, to people that speak Russian, for the most part. People that understand how the Soviet Union worked. This is a shock to the West, especially just a lay person in the West. And who are the Western politicians? These are democracies. They are people just like you and me. They're not superheroes. So the Western politicians, they are very weak on their understanding with nuance and depth how the Putin regime actually works. And that has been the gap that I thought I could help close by publishing the very first letter. At that point, regardless of whether it was real from inside the FSB or not, the information inside it is real. It's correct. There's no indication that any information that's in there is somehow falsified at all to this day. To the contrary, a lot of things. So these letters have had a lot of predictive power. One of the key examples that stands out, but it's not the only example at all, is his mention of the operation by the GRU to fabricate evidence to accuse Ukraine of working on building a dirty bomb, like to attack Russia, as a post-invasion explanation of why the invasion happened. That letter was published on, whatever day it was published on, I can't remember right now. I translated it, posted it on the next day. Within several hours of me posting that translation, just serendipitously, the Kremlin official communication mirrored exactly that accusation that Ukraine is building a dirty bomb to attack Russia, right? This stuff is just, it's all crazy. It's very simplistic, I think, at the end of the day. Once we, get a deeper understanding of how this like Russian, Kremlin propaganda works, it's not that sophisticated, but there's a serious problem, I think, with the Western media in really just parroting and just amplifying whatever the Russian propaganda is coming out. Like that message itself is somehow news. That's a huge problem. If they're going to report on Russian propaganda, they need to actually really paint a nuanced context around it, why it's happening, and how to interpret that propaganda if they really want to cover it. I don't really see much point in covering it personally, but if they're going to cover it, I think it's their obligation. But the problem with that is that they can't offer that context, and they can't offer that correct lens through which that kind of Russian propaganda needs to be viewed, exactly because they don't understand Russia. Because the journalists are normal people too. They're regular people like you and me. So the upcoming information that we will be publishing in a coordinated manner with Vladimir, and again, this is something that I have authorization from Vladimir to tell you, is what will really demonstrate. It will provide further very specific information that the Wind of Change is hoping will convince the West to take these letters seriously. These aren't some fakes. This isn't some disinformation. This started very organically between two real people. And I think another problem that we have in the West, it has to do with, like movies, this culture of how we perceive our own intelligence services. It's a much healthier approach and a state of mind to have when any government intelligence organization is being discussed from a prism that it is a structure just like any private business, right? Like any company, any big company. There are people that are really good. There are people that are not so good. Not necessarily the right people might be getting promoted and making the decisions, because everybody it's all people. They're not all just like crazy superheroes with superpowers. They're mostly filled with very intelligent people that do know what they're doing. So if we just take a step back and approach it from that perspective, I think it will really help ground yourself in being able to think critically about all these goings on. So I'm gonna do a little bit of a tangent, but since we still have, I don't know how many people, but it's definitely a lot, well over 600 people listening. I'm happy to keep going, and so from this point, I'm gonna offer just a little bit of just my theory of what may have happened pre-invasion, and some of the things that might help explain what was in the news, right? I think the U.S. Government's preemptive disclosure of intelligence pre-invasion, in terms of warning the world about the kind of false flags that Putin was going to try to use as a pretext for the impending invasion, I think that was just fantastic strategy. I think that really caught the Kremlin off balance. It also appears to be that strategic dissemination of declassified information from the U.S. probably delayed the invasion. So I think, that was just very good strategy. But you may recall how there was a lot of talk with pretty good specifics as to how the impending invasion was going to actually happen in certain stages. So it was U.S. government officials. I remember watching them on TV describing these steps. I remember reading about it in the news, that there would be a very significant cyber attack on the entire Ukraine infrastructure, so that essentially the entire country would be blacked out, and communications would be disrupted. Then it would be lots of softening up of Ukraine from afar, right, with bombing and shelling, that Russia was going to take the Ukrainian airspace very quickly, that they're going to destroy any remnants of an air force that Ukraine actually does have, which is not very big. And they're going to just claim aerial superiority over Ukraine. They're going to soften up all the targets by shelling first, and then they're going to conduct a full-scale invasion. And that they're going to take Kiev within days. I distinctly recall, the information coming from the U.S. government that was going to happen within 2-3 days. And then they might take the entire country. It might take them a little more than just 2-3 days to take the entire country, but it was going to be very fast. And so they were very right on, right? So like our U.S. government was really correct with regards to specific factual plans that the Kremlin had pre-invasion. Like when the invasion is going to start, they called it. U.S. intelligence was right on the money with that. But the forecasting of what was going to happen after the invasion turned out to be all wrong. And we should always try to look for a simple explanation for those kind of things. And the simple explanation that I have been able to come up with that really explains this very, just it's a beautiful explanation. The U.S. intelligence sources inside the Kremlin and the FSB are very high up. So, as these letters describe, the people at the top completely believe their own crap, that this is how this invasion is going to happen, and they are going to take Ukraine in just a matter of days. And so that intelligence that the Kremlin and the top echelons of the FSB themselves believed believed that that is how the invasion was actually going to happen. That is what got picked up by the U.S. intelligence. And the U.S. intelligence, because the Kremlin was so convinced that this was right, and they were so confident in how they're going to approach this invasion and what the result was going to be, the U.S. intelligence just decided to believe that too, that Russia was going to take Kiev in 2-3 days. So I always think that it's best to look for the simplest explanation. And that seems to be, a very, very, very clean explanation of how the U.S. got so much right in terms of intelligence, and then just mirrored some of the Kremlin's delusions about what's going to transpire after the actual invasion starts. So what I can do is I asked for some questions, so I can start doing a little bit of that. I'm going to start looking at the questions that you guys have asked before I started this audio. Let's see. One second. And by the way, this is recorded, so this will be posted as well. Okay, so some questions. All right, so there's a guy saying, "Dude, why are you stealing the thunder of Gulagunyet?" So Gulagunyet is Vladimir Osechkin's project. I already addressed it, but I can reiterate. Vladimir and I are in close collaboration, and we're doing this together as a team. I'm not stealing anything from Vladimir, and he's extremely happy that these events unfolded in such a way to where he's gotten so much attention from the West that was so important. Are you worried about your safety? I'm not, because I do have full confidence in the United States intelligence community. I'm absolutely convinced that if there is any kind of threat on me because I am in the United States, that the U.S. intelligence community will be able to take the right steps to protect me. Is Putin still considered sane and rational? So I mean, he's delusional in his ideology. So he is convinced in his belief that Ukraine is not a country. One thing that was really, really poignant, actually, that an insider in Russia had. One second. So one thing that an insider in Russia talked about in an interview, I can't remember his name right now, but it's a person that knows Putin personally, a journalist. He talked about how Putin, in Putin's mind, World War II never ended. Even though Putin was too young to participate in World War II, you're right, he was, I don't know if he wasn't even born then. But his ideology is that he's still in World War II. And the Soviet Union collapse was a huge tragedy. And his ambition, the way that he sees himself, the way that he wants history books to write about him, is as a person that unified all the Slavic people in the world and was like a great ruler, comparable to some, whatever rulers he admires. I mean, somebody that he really admires is Stalin. That goes without question. So I can't remember if it's true or not, but I remember how Putin's relative, father or grandfather, somebody, was Stalin's personal chef, cook. So that's his prism. That's how he views the world. He views the world as a us versus them, because he considers him to still be at war with the rest of the world. So the Cold War ended. The Soviet Union collapsed as a result. Soviet Union collapsed and the Cold War ended, but he's still in that world. He wants it back because he feels that this collapse of the Soviet Union was a huge mistake and an embarrassment for the Russian people. So he has an ideology that is absolutely delusional. He is engaging in strategy and tactics that are completely rational. I think that's a good way to describe how he behaves. I mean, there are lots of questions that I'm not going to get into. Let's see. Okay, so here's a question. I guess there may be no possibility for you to communicate back to Wind of Change, but does he have insight to the outreach his letters have gotten? I hope he feels how appreciated his contribution is. Yes. I mean, just as Vladimir was absolutely stunned at the exposure that the English translations garnered of his letter, so was the Wind of Change. The Wind of Change is aware that these letters are making an impact. That's why he started cranking out more of them after the first one in very rapid succession, because these are the things that he thought that is important for the Western world to understand about Russia. We cannot face and defeat something that we don't understand. And that is the purpose of these letters. Question: does Western intelligence have access to these letters? I mean, there's no question. I mean, this is public. These letters are public in Russian. I mean, another thing I can also mention as an aside, I've been contacted by quite a few former intelligence officers of different countries in the West, and none of them had any sliver of a doubt after the initial several letters that this stuff is exactly what it is. And I've also been offered help by such people, which is just fantastic. After the first letter, you might think, well, maybe this is Ukrainian government disinformation, which would be just genius. That was definitely a possibility, right? Or Polish, or somebody that's on our side from the West. But that still makes no sense if you really start analyzing the content. And also, the upcoming information that will be published looks like it. I can't tell you exactly when we'll be able to publish it just yet. That will lay that question to rest once and for all. It is going to be just, I think, shocking, and I wasn't exaggerating when I mentioned that. I do think that when the CIA director actually sees it, he might drop his coffee in amazement. It's not crazy strategic things that need to be kept secret for somebody's safety or something like that from the overall perspective. Guys, now there's a pretty significant segment within the FSB trying to ring all these alarm bells for the West to listen up and actually do something to stop Putin, because we are gonna have a mass extermination of people coming up here in Ukraine. That was their line as people that work inside the Russian intelligence, inside the FSB. That's when they decided we're gonna have to risk more in terms of like personal safety and those kind of things, but we got to convince the West to take this stuff seriously. And it's their response to the active, relatively new disinformation campaign that was started by the FSB, by a separate office inside the FSB, to discredit these letters in the West. So they're responding to showing, hey, here's the proof. These letters are not fake. Let's see, more questions. Yeah, so right, again, it's there. I just want to reiterate, right? So these are letters that are going back and forth. This is not a one-way communication. It's just that Vladimir is not publishing his communication to the wind of change, because I mean, there's no reason to. I have no idea what happened to Defense Minister Shoigu. Apparently, he's not been publicly seen for some time now. Have not heard anything about that. So I can also offer another thought of mine, right? Understanding like all this background and haven't spent a lot of time with these letters. It takes a long time to translate them to do it justice, to do it correctly. The thing that should be, I think, pretty obvious is that if the West actually responds with just conventional weapons militarily to stop the war crimes and the genocide that's happening inside Ukraine, just within the borders of Ukraine, that is the most efficient, fastest, best path to maximizing the possibility of a palace coup against Putin inside Russia. So, I mean, Putin might get deposed without that happening, but that will obviously result in just a ton more civilian deaths in Ukraine, a lot, and just total destruction, annihilation of the country. But beyond that, it just that is the push that the West, I think, needs to make, because once there's a significant portion of the Russian military that just destroyed inside Ukraine, that support to overthrow Putin is just gonna grow inside Russia exponentially. But there's also a problem of timing, right? This window is not going to be open forever. Once Putin actually completely consolidates all control and squashes all potential dissent around him in the Kremlin, in the FSB, surrounds himself with people that are just in a cult of Putin, that will do anything that he wants them to do, and will do everything to protect him. We're going to be in a situation like North Korea, right? So that's already beginning to happen. We do still have that window of opportunity, but it's not going to be there forever. So that's why there's a sense of urgency from multiple perspectives, not just saving human lives, which of course is just morally, it's the best thing to do. But it's something that is tactically it's going to be crucial. That is the way to facilitate an actual overthrow of Putin. And of course, once his removed from power, then he actually would. So once Putin is removed from power, which I mean, I'm rather hopeful that everybody's going to do everything to make that happen. Obviously, the invasion of Ukraine is going to stop. The genocide is going to stop. The extermination of just cities and civilians is going to end. Then we're going to have to start working on the next steps. There's going to be a lot of uncertainties, right, of what will happen after Putin is removed. But regardless of what happens after that, we first have to accomplish that, right? And we have to be agile. So in terms of sanctions by the West, I think that's been just a really well executed strategy by the United States and our partners in Europe. It is placed the exact kind of pressure domestically in Russia to bring that possibility of a popular overthrow of Putin to try to make that turn that into reality. The question there is sanctions. It may take a while for that to have that result, if it does, and we shouldn't be just banking on one certain strategy that would result in Putin being overthrown. We should just pile on from every single conceivable approach. So destroying the Russian military inside Ukraine, that is not an attack on Russia. With conventional weapons, there's not going to be any nuclear response to that. That is just like Putin is invading. He invaded Ukraine. He wanted Belarus to invade Ukraine with him, although it seems like that's petered out. Belarus top rank commanders in the Belarus military have refused, which is fantastic. The railroad employees in Belarus at the border of Ukraine have sabotaged those rails so that Russian military equipment and supplies can't reach Ukraine. So that's really great development. But if we just sit idly by and just wait for sanctions to continue to squeeze on Russia as a country, that on its own may not lead to an overthrow of Putin. We need to do more, and it requires military action. This is already a war between that Putin started. It's a war that Putin started against the world, and he's not going to back down. Going back to the fact that he is convinced the West is not going to respond militarily. So what the West should be doing from sort of a global perspective is do the opposite of what Putin expects us to do. That approach, I think, is very important because this is war. All right, so I think I'm going to wrap this up. I really appreciate everybody tuning in. It seems like essentially everybody that started in terms of the number of listeners is still here. I really appreciate your support. I really appreciate your curiosity and hunger to understand the situation with FSB letters and who Vladimir Osechkin is and what's going on. Again, right, I haven't I'm very careful. Like everything I've provided in this audio cast it's public information and combined with some of my theories. There are no secrets in this. Really, thank you. It's been tough. I've barely slept the last 4 weeks, but Your support has allowed me to keep going and knowing that this is making a difference. And I am just doing everything I possibly can to try to contribute in whatever small way I can to bring an end to this war. And we need to start actually thinking more critically, thinking more strategically of what we can do to stop this terror. And I think the world will be better for it. Uh, you know, the entire free world has unified so much. I can't remember in my lifetime this level of unity, and we shouldn't squander that. We should act with conviction. We should act with courage. We should do what's right. Doing what's right will always pay dividends. So thank you again for listening, and I am